What remains of what remains. His stomach was off. It might have been the coffee he drank earlier that morning. There was an open bag of Ethiopian in the garde-manger in the kitchen wall. The rotted screen open to vermin and pigeon droppings. The coffee pot was old and neglected. There was black gunk in the bottom where the water and coffee filter went, and in the upper part a sticky film had accumulated, as if the residue of time itself were left by some unseen sleight of hand. It was not his coffee pot, not his black gunk, nor his mysterious funk. It was the first morning. He'd made coffee to stake his claim on this small sublet, temporary like so many others. Each time he moved, he suffered another minor loss of some necessity, its importance never catastrophic, but always causing a mild preoccupation about whether he'd simply stuffed it in a pocket or between the pages of a book or left it in a taxi. There had been a big send-off this time, a crushing 3-story affair of just about everyone he knew, and twice again as many. Someone had joked about there being a lot of love in this room, and he'd thought it was really more about an excuse to drink in excess, show face, and say you'd seen so-and-so, and so-and-so did this or that. Here he knew a few people, and they'd welcomed him when he called to say he'd arrived in their city, telling him they'd call him back later, or tomorrow. None of them ever did. And it was okay, because he'd come here to work. He had begun to, trying to ignore the little bit of hurt he felt by their indifference. He'd had music on from the time he'd arrived, but now he sat in silence, believing that this was the only way the rooms could fully penetrate. He tried to think of a better word for empty or hollow. He'd just finished reading a novel of Hemingway's, and the words hollow and empty had appeared 2 or 3 times to describe what he felt now. But he didn't want to recycle Hemingway's words, especially ones written decades ago. He tried to think of the worst book he'd ever read. It was the only novel written by a woman who'd traveled through North Africa disguised as a man, whose life was a better book than the one she'd written with the angry sentimentality of youth. She'd lived a rugged, debauched life in the early part of the 20th century, defined by sex, drugs, riding horses in desert fantasias, and Sufism. She died with novelistic irony at the age of 27 in a flash flood in the Algerian desert. He remembered where he was, which was a very different place than North Africa, though there were many North Africans living in this neighborhood, and he considered going outside. He'd come here for many reasons, not the least of which was the street and cafe life, the way people interacted, and the abundance of good food and wine. It was gray and cold, and he wasn't sure what he would do except walk. He felt a cozy loneliness, facing the 2 large windows with white tulle curtains. It was a narrow street, and the building across the way was almost close enough to be another room. In fact, the light from his room, reflected in the glass, superimposed the wall behind him onto the darkened window across the street, as though he inhabited both rooms simultaneously. The sky was darkening, and he lit 2 candles on the mantel. The candlelight warmed the room, but the silence continued, unabated. He sat at his desk and wrote everything down, everything he thought, felt, saw. This didn't amount to much, and only convinced him further that he lacked imagination. He felt as if he were caught between 2 points of an ellipsis. Something brushed against his foot. It was a noiseless contact, and he wasn't sure if the movement of his head had caused something to reflect off his glasses, or if something animate had streaked across his peripheral vision. He got up and walked to the couch where it seemed headed. He heard nothing. Then a faint crackle, like paper rustling or the crunch of aluminum foil. His first thought was mouse, but he dismissed it, if for no other reason than he didn't want to deal with one if it was. All options for getting rid of mice were unpleasant at best. One could murder it with some grisly trap that would crush its head, or crack its body in two. Or, less messy, you could snare it intact and alive and drown it. Some preferred the so-called humane practice of releasing it on a random street where it could find new quarters, leaving someone else to contend with it. This seemed a coward's way out. He returned to his desk and wrote. Something brushed against his foot. He heard something like paper rustling. The options for getting rid of mice either involved murder in the form of some grisly trap or capturing it alive and pawning it off on someone else. He quickly decided that it was in fact a mouse. He would capture it, take it to a random street far from his apartment, and dump it. He felt a headache beginning and realized it was 5 o'clock and he hadn't eaten anything since the night before except the coffee. He went to the store and came back with bread, cheese, instant coffee, eggs, and a tin of butter cookies. After he'd eaten, he brought his dishes to the sink and noticed a small brown pellet on the windowsill. He picked it up with the crumpled napkin and threw it into the trash. Shit. His first spoken word of the day. He sat at his desk. The headache was subsiding into a pale dullness. The pauses between the sound of keys being tapped were getting longer. He looked at the corners of the floor, wondering if it would dare show itself again, or if its moment of bravado had passed. He turned off the light and sat without moving, taking shallow breaths. After 2 or 3 minutes, he decided this was not the way to go about it. Anyway, what he really wanted to do was lie down and begin reading a new book. Forget the mouse, the lack of company, the work. But he had committed not to read anything until he'd finished writing this, no matter how short, as long as it was done. He turned on the light, lit candles, and slit a CD of 12th century Spanish music. He opened the window a crack to let in some fresh air. Though the window was open, the flames burned straight and steady. Even the curtains moved not. He was thinking in 12th century syntax. Not good. He wanted to keep to simple declarative sentences. Though technically the curtains moved not was a simple declarative sentence. He liked the sound of it better than the curtains didn't move or the curtains did not move. They moved not. The mouse appeared not. The headache died not. The words came not. Then, as if in answer to his thoughts, he saw the mouse, raised on its hind legs in front of the fireplace. Jesus fucking Christ. His second, third, and fourth spoken words of the day. In response, the mouse fell forward onto its forelegs. Contact. The mouse was white with pink snout, tail, and fingers. This was no ordinary street mouse, but had clearly led the privileged life of a laboratory animal. Aside from the mysteries of its origins, he wondered what form of acculturation it had been subjected to, what intellectual skills it had obtained. The tin of cookies was still on the table. He took one out and broke off a tiny piece with his fingernail. The mouse stood up again. Its nose twitched. He tossed the crumb to the middle of the floor and watched it cautiously approach. Filthy animals. Bah. His mother would have disapproved. But here it was, risking a horrible medieval death. Maybe it even had some intuitive sense of his intentions. Some primitive yet highly attuned insight into trust. It stood at attention. He also stopped. It crouched to sniff the crumb, nibbled, then disappeared with it behind the couch. He followed its movements with his eyes as though any slight shift of his position might spook it. He waited for a sound, maybe a rustling, but there was nothing. He went back to his laptop and typed. This was no ordinary mouse. It had been born and raised in a college laboratory not too far away, where introductory social science students were provided with hands-on experience in behavioral psychology. This mouse, with an uncanny sense of direction, had not only learned to find its way out of the most complex labyrinths, it had also, in an almost occult fashion, absorbed the methods of its superiors. Eventually, it feigned confusion, convincing them it was an inferior subject for their experiments. A starry-eyed freshman rescued it, carried it home in a shoebox with holes poked in the top for air. It managed to gnaw its way out and escaped through the open bathroom window. So he would have a mouse. A mouse he had. Extermination would happen not. He didn't bother writing any of this down. Who would care about his idiotic manipulations of subject and predicate? He ate a cookie and went to sleep. He woke up and couldn't remember what day it was, as if coming out of anesthesia for a surgery to which he had unknowingly submitted. He'd had a bad dream about the mouse. He couldn't remember any of it, but was unable to shed the nightmare of its growing significance. He washed and shaved and went out for coffee and a newspaper. He sat in the cafe, comfortably surrounded by the rapid foreign speech going on at the tables. There were intermittent explosions of exasperation about things that were incomprehensible to him. He only understood the occasional imperative or exclamation. Understood enough to know that this was a language in which many sentences were punctuated by exclamation points. If he were more fluent, he could tell in complex sentences how the mouse, no ordinary mouse, had suddenly appeared and seemed to understand his benevolence. He thought this was a special mouse, cute, even pretty maybe, in its way. It must be a female, he thought, since there were no signs of aggression. Rather an intelligent survival instinct, an intuitive yet rational balance of trust and caution. Of course, he knew nothing about mouse behavior, or whether it was gender-specific, but decided to trust his sense that a rapport was developing between them. He wondered if he would see her again. He walked home past the college and watched the students going in and out, milling around on the steps. A girl with auburn hair and a backpack, one foot resting on the step, exposing a rosy knee, gestured and laughed with another girl. He wondered if she was explaining how she'd lost her lab mouse. He decided to call one of his indifferent friends to meet for a drink. He phoned Nelson and they agreed to meet at 8 o'clock at the brasserie near his flat. Nelson said he would buy the drinks. He waited about 20 minutes and then took a walk around the block. Just as he returned, Nelson entered the brasserie. He called out and they embraced. They took a table in a corner by the window. Nelson was a coquettish man who dyed his hair red, dressed in leather, and wore pointy shoes. According to the rambling story he told one night in an East Village bar, he was a Montenegrin gypsy. Without occasion, he always arrived with gifts that seemed randomly chosen and dressed conspicuously beyond his means. He spoke 3 languages fluently and had been working on a memoir for the past 20 years. He was also writing a doctoral thesis on the visionary poetry of an obscure 16th century Italian gypsy who had almost become pope and had influenced Simone Weil, among others. At the Sorbonne, he'd met and married his first wife, Monique, whose family owned a vineyard in the south of France. He was supporting himself as well as an ailing father, working as a translator for marketing companies. He sent money or presents, when he could, to Monique and a daughter who were living in the parental chateau in the Dordogne. Monique, her impregnation, had been a momentary lapse, one of his dramatic experiments. Nelson used his charm to find a place to test his sperm. An anorexic speed freak with loads of money and a tall, reedy body with tiny breasts. She had envisioned herself as the essential character at the lofty turning point of his memoir. Unfortunately, this was never to be, as the memoir would finish Nelson rather than vice versa. Nelson shoved a plastic bag into his hand. "Just a little something I thought you'd like. A present." "Oh," he said, putting his coat on the back of the chair with some confusion. He took a book out of the bag. "Have you read it?" Nelson asked. Gulag Archipelago. No, I meant to. Haven't yet." "Oh, it's really something. You must read it." "Thanks, yeah, next on my list. So tell me, what are you up to?" Working, translating." His mind drifted from the details of Nelson's schedule and the demographics of the cereal-eating community in a country where breakfast had traditionally been coffee and a cigarette. He imagined the mouse rooting around in the corners of the kitchen where coffee grinds had fallen, saw her scampering up the walls of the living room in caffeinated elation, exploring objects left on the table, dipping into the dregs of last night's wine glass. He nodded, never taking his eyes from Nelson. "And your father, how is she? I mean, he." "Oh, he's out of the hospital. They sent him home. They needed the bed. I have to come home every day and cook him lunch and dinner. It's not easy, but what can I do?" He constructed a mental picture of a mouse cage, a kind of play area where she would have room to roam. He would provide her with scraps and leftovers so she would get fat and healthy, and maybe even learn to sit with him in the evenings. "I have a mouse." "What's that?" "I have a mouse that lives with me." "I know how you can get rid of it." "I don't know if I want to get rid of it." "What you need is a cat. Maybe you could borrow my friend Dino's." It's like a pet." "What do you mean?" "It's white, with pink extremities. Cute." "Are you fucking with me?" "Don't laugh. I think it's an escaped lab mouse." "Dino has this big raunchy cat. It'll kill anything that moves. He brought him over from Belgrade. It was living in the street where he found him. One of his ears got chewed off in a fight." "How's your father? I mean your daughter, Sophie. She was getting tall last time I saw her. Have you worked it out so you can see her more?" "No, Monique's family is twisting her mind against the idea. They think I'm some kind of junkie pickpocket." He could put plants in there, some tree branches for her to climb on, maybe make a little labyrinth to keep her intellectually engaged. "I only get her on school holidays and one weekend a month." "Well, I guess that leaves you more freedom to work." He checked his watch and began putting his jacket on. "I'd better get going. Still a little jet-lagged." "Okay, listen, if you want me to call Dino..." No need. I'll give you a call in a couple of days. Oh, and thanks for the book and everything." "My pleasure." He stopped at the corner store to buy a bottle of water and some chocolate. When he reached into his pocket for his wallet, it wasn't there. He tried the other pocket, but it wasn't in there either. He rummaged through all his pockets. How could this have happened? The couple of times he'd had his wallet stolen, he'd remembered being jostled or bumped into. But this time, no one had even touched him. Fortunately, he'd had less than 10 euros, and he'd left his credit cards at home. Except for the few business cards from people he'd never see again, and the fact that he liked the wallet, it was no great loss. The light was on in the bathroom. He couldn't remember if he'd left it on or not. He told himself that he must have, since no one else could have done it, and it couldn't have gone on by itself. He opened the fridge and took out what was left of the cheese and bread and poured himself a glass of wine. Light from the full moon came through the window. He scanned the edges of the floor and the shadows under the chairs. He felt at peace, enjoying the rosy warmth of the wine, confident she would reappear. He felt it. She was being coy, timid little thing. He got down on his knees, searching under the furniture. Then he lay on his back, very still. He woke, feeling clammy with the sun in his eyes. The dripping faucet and gas heater going on and off gave the impression of other living things in the apartment. The first night it had disturbed his sleep, but he was used to it now. He made himself some instant coffee and put on the radio. He took a pen and paper and began drawing out a rough draft of what the mouse habitat would look like. He planned to buy some fine wire mesh at a garden supply store and partition off the corner next to the couch. There would be a kind of roofed labyrinth constructed of wood, a small herb garden for healthy nibbling, and a platform where food and water could be kept in fresh supply. He would build a little cave out of self-hardening clay where she could retire when she wanted to rest in safety and comfort. This would be the basic plan, and he supposed after a while he would make additions as he learned her needs and habits. After about a week, the cage was finished to his satisfaction. He put water and fresh cheese and bread inside, leaving the door open. He was certain that in time she would discover it and take up residence. He might even continue to leave the door open and show that this was not a trap. He was not a jailer. He sat down and typed. This was a mouse. If he were a bird, he'd be an eagle. Because what is an eagle if not a human that flies? He would be the mouse-eating bird that does not eat the mouse. Everything a bird that is left when predation is eliminated. He read it over. He was putting things between quotation marks. He felt uncomfortable with this. He finished building the habitat, as he now called it. It was designed and constructed so that they would share the same room while she enjoyed the freedom and safety of her own personal space. He placed his hand inside to sense the temperature and relative moisture. He lit candles and poured a glass of wine and waited for her. The door of the habitat was open. It had a hedge leading from the door to a little meadow of astroturf with a patch of large plastic sunflowers. It was surrounded by hills that rose into pink and violet peaks. There was a platform built of slate where two tiny Provençal pots held some gorgonzola and a few crumbs of 7-grain bread. Water was pumped into a little pond where he'd made a recess in the clay. The floor of the cave was covered with straw placed on top of a coffee filter for easy disposal. He'd thought of everything. Now, he only had to wait. How could she help being attracted to the place? Once she was inside, he'd probably have to close her in at first. He would shut the door softly, then, after a while, once she got used to it, her new home, and to him, he would leave the door open. Permanently. Trust would be firmly established. At its least, she would know where her food came from. He took another bite of the gorgonzola. Rain started to hit the window. There was thunder. The candle flames seemed to jump. All this would scare her. She didn't know yet what refuge awaited her. He finished the rest of the bottle of Medoc and fell asleep to the sound of rain, Hemingway's Garden of Eden open on his chest. He dreamt he was on the floor with her, both of them eating mackerel with mustard sauce out of a tin. He was afraid of cutting his tongue on the edge. He looked at her tiny tongue, getting bigger and bigger, until it was macroscopic. He felt a tremendous thirst. He woke up and reached for water on the night table. The glass was empty. He felt dehydrated and remembered the gorgonzola and red wine. He got a cold bottle of water from the fridge and swallowed it too fast, choking and feeling a sharp pain. It was 4:30. He peeked into the dark living room. Nothing moved. He walked quietly to the corner and looked into the habitat. The rain had stopped. Faucet dripped, and the gas flame of the water heater kicked in. He crawled inside and looked into the cave, thinking maybe she was quietly asleep. It was empty. the straw undisturbed. Oh, this is where he would end the story, he thought. Why drag it out? The fucking mouse isn't coming back, and this guy is standing here with his dick in his hand. Let's face it, he went to all this trouble. Gorgonzola, for fuck's sake, and no mouse. He laughed at his stupidity, put the bottle of water on the floor next to the pond, curled up into a ball, and fell asleep.